Last time we spoke about Chinese laborers during the Great War. Although China took up a stance of neutrality at the offset of World War I, there was still an enormous desire to join the Entente side. The new Republic of China wanted to get a seat at the peace table to hopefully undo some of the terrible unequal treaties. To procure the seat, China approached France, Britain, Russia, and by the end of the war, America to send their workers to help the war effort. On the Western and Eastern fronts, Chinese laborers made a colossal contribution that tipped the scale of the war towards the Entente victory. On the Eastern front, some Chinese fought in irregular units, and under emergency circumstances even on the Western front. When the laborers came back home, they brought with them new ideas that would dramatically change China. The people of China demanded change, but how would China fare by the end of the Great War? This episode is The 21 Demands and the Walrus Emperor. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just wanted to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all of that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there I've just released a full documentary on the Battle of Attu. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel where you can find exclusive podcasts. Last month's podcast was a two-part series on the USS Enterprise, and polls will go up soon for this month's podcast. So if you join up, perhaps you can vote on what will be the next episode. Stating all of that, it's the best way to support me if you'd like, and it's as low as $2 a month. Taking a look back at China at the outbreak of World War I, Yuan Shikai certainly had a lot on his plate. When European nations began declaring war in late July, it brought military conflict to China. Yuan Shikai had his advisors think over all the options laid bare before them, and they decided to proclaim neutrality on August the 6th of 1914. As we have seen, the other great powers, particularly that of Japan, they did not care so much about China's sovereignty. Japan besieged Tsingtao, despite China tossing protests, but Yuan Shikai had little choice but to permit the Japanese military actions. The fighting that broke out in the Kiaochou area would constitute the only acts of war on Chinese soil during the First World War. Unfortunately, the Japanese were not going to settle with just defeating the Germans. Japan had already gained an enormous sphere of influence in Manchuria after victories in the First Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War. When China underwent its Xinhai Revolution, it became more fragile, quite vulnerable, and thus it opened a floodgate. With World War I raging on in Europe, the global powers were all too preoccupied to contest any actions in Asia, giving Japan an enormous opportunity. Japan sought to expand her commercial interests in Manchuria, but also elsewhere. After seizing Tsingtao, Prime Minister Okuma Shigenobu and Foreign Minister Kato drafted the infamous 21 Demands. From the Japanese perspective, Yuan Shikai's government looked rogue, untrustworthy. They had no real idea how long the thing would even stand up. It might crumble at a moment's notice. Their leases in South Manchuria were about to run out, thus they needed to extend upon them. Then there was the situation of Shandong province. It's always Shandong, as they say. Japan was technically occupying it, having taken it from the Germans, who had previously held a concession over it. Being a concession, it was known Shandong would be returned to China. And when I say Shandong province, I don't actually mean the entire province. It's really just the peninsula. After Japan took Tsingtao, there was kind of an unknown variable. Japan also had some economic trade with China that made her somewhat dependent upon her. For example, Yawata, Japan's first iron and steel complex that had been financed with Chinese indemnity payments, ironically, was also dependent on Chinese raw materials that had been steaming into Japan since 1901. Japan industrialists needed to firm up their commercial relations with places like Hanyu Ping Works in Hankow. They also hoped to establish joint Sino-Japanese control over strategic resources. Japan also strongly sought to be the dominant power in Asia. She wanted the Western powers to simply back off. With these things in mind, the 21 demands were born. As for the word demand, they were more technically requests. Nevertheless, they amounted to substantial infractions upon Chinese sovereignty. On January 18th of 1915, Japanese ambassador Aoki Ikki delivered the 21 demands to Yuan Shikai in a private audience. They were delivered with a warning of dire consequences if the Beiyang government would reject them. And I know it might be quite boring and a rather university professor kind of thing to do, but I will read the demands out. The 21 demands were divided into 5 groups. Group number 1 had 4 demands, confirming Japan's recent seizure of German ports and operations in Shandong province. It also expanded Japan's sphere of influence over railways, coasts, and major cities in the province. Group number 2 had 7 demands, pertaining to Japan's South Manchurian Railway Zone, extending the leasehold over the territory for 99 years, and expanding Japan's sphere of influence in southern Manchuria and eastern Inner Mongolia. Then they wanted to include rights of settlement and extraterritoriality, the appointment of financial and administrative officials to the government, and priority for Japanese investments in those areas. Japan demanded access to Inner Mongolia for raw materials, as a manufacturing site, and as a strategic buffer against Russian encroachment in Korea. Group number 3 had 2 demands: to give Japan control over the Hanyiping, Hanyang, Dai, and Pingxiang mining and metallurgical complexes in central China that were already in deep debt to Japan. Group number 4 had 1 demand: to bar China from giving any further coastal or island concessions to a third nation. Group number 5 had 7 demands, and they were by far the most aggressive. China was to hire Japanese advisors who could take effective control over China's finance and police. Japan would be empowered to build 3 major railways, and also Buddhist temples and schools. Japan would gain effective control over Fujian province, across the Taiwanese Strait from Taiwan, which of course had been ceded to Japan back in 1895. Now, Japan knew full well what they were asking for, particularly in group number 5, which was like basically asking China to become a full colony under Japanese rule. Traditional history holds the narrative that Japan simply was taking advantage of the First World War to press China for imperial gains, and Yuan Shikai accepted the demands in exchange for funding and supporting of his future monarchical project. Yuan Shikai ever since had been vilified as a sort of traitor who negotiated a dirty deal with the Japanese. But it's a bit more complicated than that. Yuan Shikai was outraged when the Japanese minister came over with the demands. It was a heavy blow against him and his new government. According to U.S. Minister Paul Reinsch, Yuan was stunned, unable to speak for a long time. When the Japanese began trying to smooth-talk Yuan Shikai and his advisors, they made flowery speeches about how Japan would shoulder the modernizing efforts of China, and that the demands were in the spirit of amity, friendship, and peace. Yuan Shikai remarked to this, "Our country would no longer be a country, and our people would be slaves." Yuan Shikai understood full well what Japan sought, but he was powerless to stop them. What he did do was try to curb some of the damage by delaying the response and by replacing his foreign minister, Sun Baoqi, with Liu Jiangxiang, whose slow and overly polite manner greatly frustrated and pissed off the Japanese. Basically, he was kind of like a filibuster type. It was the classic Chinese approach to diplomacy: stall, stall, and stall some more. It was said that Liu would often spend more than an hour in courtesies like tea drinking before getting down to business. Over 24 meetings would be held about the demands. Now, the Japanese wanted all of this to be kept secret, as it would hurt both nations' reputations on the world stage. Yuan Shikai did not play by their rules, however. Instead, he leaked the demands to the foreign diplomats and representatives, and in turn, this got leaked to the media, causing a nationwide protest. Yuan Shikai hoped the protests would push the Japanese to back off. Yuan Shikai also tried to persuade foreign intervention. First, he sent his Japanese advisor, Nago, back to Japan to prod the general. Then he began speaking to the Americans, who were very focused on maintaining their open-door policy, and the British, who were very suspicious of Japan's intentions. Neither nation wanted to see China simply falling into Japan's orbit. And of course, Yuan Shikai tried to negotiate the demands themselves, particularly the Group 5 demands, which he pointed out. These items interfere with China's internal politics and infringe on our national sovereignty. It is hard to agree. Towards the economic demands, he would also remark, "These demands are too broad and they cannot be enforced." Regarding Japanese demands that China not lease islands or coastal regions to, quote, Tagua, a third country, Yuan Shikai wanted to change the words Tagua to Wagua, foreign countries. That change altered China's national interests, for it meant China would not allow any country, including Japan, to lease or rent Chinese islands or coastal regions. It's all in the fine print, as they say. Overall, though, Yuan Shikai was very careful not to be overly aggressive, for he knew full well no one would be able to help China at any moment if Japan decided to start another war. He also was playing with fire massively, for he unleashed Chinese nationalism, something that could and would get out of hand. Basically, when he leaked these documents to the foreign powers, of course, it got leaked to the media, and the Chinese people found out. I can't stress this enough, but between the years of 1916 to 1919, this issue of leaking documents and the people finding out would become a reoccurring theme. And the Chinese people would rise up in an enormous way come the year 1919. Now, the Chinese stalled for as long as they could, but the Japanese patience would run out on May the 7th. Japanese ambassador Aoki issued an ultimatum, but this time with only 13 demands. Yuan Shikai's government were given only 2 days to accept it. After months of tenacious diplomacy, the final version of the demands was quite different. The fifth group had been dropped, and more items were less harsh. Yuan Shikai was powerless. He was going to have to accept the demands, and he knew full well this was yet again another humiliation against China and her people. The Supreme State Council met on the 8th, where Yuan Shikai told his officials it was shameful and heartbreaking agony to accept such demands from demons, but they had no choice, lest war ravage them all again. He looked at his council and he stated bluntly, China needed to catch up to Japan within a decade to remedy the situation. Yuan Shikai would issue secretly on May the 14th a notice to high-ranking officials throughout the country, telling them to expose Japanese ambitions and China's debility. He urged them to bear in mind the extreme pain of this humiliation, and he advised them to work hard to create a bright future to avoid the collapse of the state and the extinction of their nation. The demands were reluctantly accepted on May the 9th, and henceforth May the 9th was declared a day of national humiliation. It was commemorated annually. The consequence of accepting the 13 demands became colloquially known as the Shandong problem. Again, it's always Shandong province. Now, at the beginning of the war, China supported the Entente under certain conditions. One of these conditions was Gaoqiaobei, the leased territory of Shandong Peninsula belonging to the Germans, would be returned to China. To further explain, this was a concession to Germany, and it was set to go back to China probably in the mid-1920s or earlier than that. Yet, something that would occur very often during World War I, particularly on the part of Britain, was the issue of double promising. I kind of made up that term. I don't think there's a real term for it. But Britain, during World War I, in an effort to secure allies or certain objectives, would promise two different states or non-state actors the exact same thing after the war was done. A lot of problems facing the Middle East today can be attributed to this. In the case of the Shandong problem, when Japan entered the war on behalf of the Entente powers, Britain basically promised them that they could keep their holdings. And this, of course, included Shandong. We will come back to the Shandong problem quite often for the next few episodes. But for now, we're going to start talking about Yuan Shikai again. Now, Yuan Shikai is quite a character to say the least. He was viewed very differently at given times. Take, for example, the public perception of him after the Xinhai Revolution took place. Many in China saw him as a sort of Napoleon Bonaparte-like figure. Many also questioned what Yuan Shikai truly sought. Did he believe in things like democracy? One author I have used during these recent podcasts, who in my opinion is a hilarious Yuan Shikai apologist, tried to argue this case. Yuan Shikai did not understand what democracy was. Thus, that is why he did the things he did. I am paraphrasing, of course, but basically, in my opinion, the author is just glossing over the fact that Yuan Shikai was a dictator. But anyways, beginning in 1913, there were rumors Yuan Shikai simply sought to make himself an emperor over a new dynasty. This, of course, came at a time everyone was vying for power over the new republic. China was supposed to be a republic after all. I think we all know, however, that wasn't really a reality. Yuan Shikai certainly tried to make the case he was a Republican, that he was a true believer in republicanism. He would make all these public statements espousing, "I will never proclaim myself to be a monarch." And it is just my opinion, but when a politician publicly states that they will not do something, they're about to do that thing. As we've already seen, Yuan Shikai certainly set the wheels into motion to create a dictatorship. Yet for public appearances, he kept this little charade going on about how he was doing his absolute best as the president, and that he had an unwaveringly support for republicanism. But if he did want to become a monarch, there were basically two hurdles in his way. The first one was him publicly making many statements and pledges that he would not do so. And number two, the Republican system obviously did not allow for such a thing. They did just fight a revolution to stop the monarchy after all. There were little to no options if someone wanted to make themselves emperor over China. Unless they made it seem like that's what the people wanted. And just to reiterate, the people did not want this. No one wanted this. In 1915, Yuan Shikai quasi-stopped all of his political rivals. I say quasi because there actually were rivals literally everywhere surrounding him, but for all intents and purposes, all of the power was concentrated into his own hands. Now, the apologist author I keep referring to says this about Yuan Shikai's sudden change of heart for the monarchy. His belief in superstition was perhaps another factor, for geomancers had told him that by establishing a monarchy, he would smash his family curse, which held that men in the Yuan family would rarely live beyond their 50s. The suggestion here was that he would live longer if he founded a monarchy. Also, feng shui masters had told him his ancestral tombs had shown a blessed sign favoring imperial rule. Well, I mean, if the feng shui masters told him it was a good idea, well, I guess he has to, right? The author then finishes off by stating it's a difficult question and further inquiry should be made. In the world of medicine and neuroscience, which is my first degree, you would end any scholarly article with such a statement. In the scholarly world of history writing, that is when an author knows full well they can't justify what they're writing about. According to the high-ranking official, Zhu Qiqian, who was very close to Yuan Shikai, Yuan Shikai's monarchy movement started with Kaiser Wilhelm II telling the Chinese that monarchy would be more suitable for China. British Minister Jordan had a meeting with Yuan Shikai on October the 2nd of 1915, and the topic was brought up about him becoming emperor. To this he stated, "This is China's internal affairs, which should not be interfered with by any others." American Minister Reinsch basically said the same thing when he was asked. News outlets began spreading rumors Yuan Shikai was going to declare himself emperor. In June of 1915, Japanese media reported as such, but Yuan Shikai responded, "Nothing is more foolish than a man becoming emperor. For national salvation, I have already sacrificed myself, and I would rather not sacrifice my descendants." Well, despite this, a monarchy movement began, orchestrated by many people such as Yuan Shikai's son, Yuan Keding. Our friend from the last podcast, Liang Shiyi, now Minister of Communications, raised funds and organized popular petitions for Yuan Shikai to form a monarchy. Soon, numerous petition groups, organically, with quotation marks, sprang up all over Beijing, all claiming republicanism held too many weaknesses and that China was in a dire strait, needing a strong monarchy. Petition groups sprang up in provinces urging the same thing. Beijing was filled with noisy parades, procession petitioners running around rapidly. The United Association of National Petition was founded on September the 19th of 1915 in Beijing to champion the monarchy. Supporters gathered in Beijing, producing this organic impression of everyone wanting the monarchy back. Facing so many petitioners, Yuan Shikai decided to let the people determine the future of the national political system, and by the people, I mean him. On October the 8th of 1915, he approved the order that a Tangjiang Yuan, Political Participation Council, would organize a Guomin Daibao Duaohui, a national representative assembly. They would form a final ruling on the issue. The order required all the representatives had to be elected. Each county had to choose one, and various ethnic groups, civil societies, and overseas Chinese organizations also needed to select representatives. Yuan Shikai hoped such an arrangement would dispel any perceptions he was just appointing himself emperor, which he 100% was. Each county representative went to his provincial capital to cast a ballot. The Political Participation Council in Beijing collected the ballots and announced the results. The representatives were selected and each received $500 for travel expenses. Yuan Shikai dispatched Zhu Qiqian to secretly telegram all provincial officials to regulate the election in air quotes. Yuan Shikai had all of his confidants working for his election, high-ranking officials, family members, friends, and so forth. On December the 11th of 1915, the Political Participation Council announced the results. All 1,993 ballots endorsed a constitutional monarchy with Yuan Shikai as emperor. Every single ballot. On behalf of the representatives, the council begged Yuan Shikai to assume the throne immediately, claiming it was the will of the people. Yuan Shikai declined, arguing he had pledged to support the republic, that as the guardian of republicanism, he would lose trust if he became emperor. For you Star Wars fans, I just think immediately of the emperor saying, "I love democracy." He asked the council to find another candidate. What proceeded, as you can imagine, was simply theatrics. That very afternoon, the council held a special meeting and decided to present a second imperial advocacy. In the advocacy were things proving Yuan Shikai was an indispensable ruler, qualified for taking the throne. His 6 great accomplishments were suppressing the Boxer Rebellion, enforcing progressive reforms, achieving a post-revolutionary conciliation, crushing the Second Revolution, and conducting intense diplomacy with neighbors like the Empire of Japan. To absolve Yuan Shikai of the guilt of violating his republican pledges, the document stated, "The pledge to the Republic was effective only if the people's will supported republicanism. If the people have switched to constitutional monarchy, the previous pledge was automatically relinquished. As the presidency does not exist anymore, the former presidential pledges naturally disappear." And thus, a reluctant Yuan Shikai, under extreme pressure, issued a public order declaring his acceptance on December the 13th of 1915. Thus, Yuan Shikai became the Hongxian emperor, and he began to implement imperial orders. To woo over the national elites, he created a system of noble ranks and bestowed 130 prominent individuals titles as princes, dukes, marquises, earls, viscounts, and barons. His closest friends were given special appellations and exempted from imperial duties. Xu Shicheng, Li Jingxi, Zhang Jian, and Zhao Ershun, his closest four friends, became the Songshan Xiao, four friends of Mount Song. Yet just as he was getting down to the work, as they say, an anti-Yuan movement swept the country. Go figure. High-ranking Beiyang generals and politicians were amongst Yuan Shikai's, let's call them, reluctant collaborators, and many became his opponents. His monarchy turned them hostile. Many of these men had supported him for decades, and their very careers were beholden to his patronage. But the monarchy was simply incompatible with the times. Li Yuanhong, a leading figure in the Beiyang clique, who was linked to Yuan Shikai through marriage, strongly resisted the monarchy. He was the first to have the title prince bestowed upon him, but he refused, and he threatened to commit suicide if coerced to take it. Xu Shicheng simply resigned. Feng Guozhang, a military commander in Nanjing, was very angry about the situation. Feng Guozhang came to Beijing to try and persuade Yuan Shikai to not become emperor. And Yuan Shikai promised him for months, it was only rumors, that he'd never actually do it. I bet that conversation went something like, "Come on, man!" And once he became emperor, Feng Guozhang felt betrayed, and he became quite an obstacle to Yuan Shikai. Then there was Duan Qirei, another Yuan Shikai loyalist, but he concealed his anti-monarchy stance. He simply told Yuan Shikai that if he tried to become emperor, he would become the villain in Chinese history. Duan Qirei was the only high-ranking general not to be given a noble title rank. Instead, he was given a personal chef by Yuan Shikai, and Duan Qirei made sure never to eat any food prepared by that man. All of these names, by the way, are important figures of the Beiyang clique. Cliques will become a dominating feature when we get into the warlord era. Basically, the leader of the Beiyang clique at this time was Yuan Shikai, and he had greatly pissed off all of his followers and basically everybody else in China. And of course, Dr. Sun Yat-sen responded immediately to Yuan Shikai becoming emperor, calling for, you would guess it, yes, another revolution. In his words, "The future of our motherland has suddenly become more darkened. The republic built by our martyrs has unexpectedly turned out to be the private possession of the Yuan family. 400 million compatriots wept profusely, and see the third revolution as the best remedy for national salvation." Dr. Sun Yat-sen portrayed Yuan Shikai as a minzei, national thief, and now the Chinese people lived in bondage. He called upon the people to fight and save the republic. Soon, KMT revolutionaries began to seize county seats, first in Shandong province, led by Zhujiang, and then they occupied parts in Guangdong and attacked the provincial capital there. However, Dr. Sun Yat-sen was not the only player in town anymore. There was the new nation army led by Cai Le in Yunnan province and Liang Qijiao. Liang Qijiao was the first big voice against Yuan Shikai's monarchy movement when they were emerging as rumors. He was also something of kind of a sensei to Cai Le, pushing him to coordinate military commanders in the southwest. Liang Qijiao left northern China for Shanghai after Yuan Shikai proclaimed himself emperor, and then he made his way to Hong Kong before traveling to Vietnam. From there, he gradually traveled to join up with the Nation Army in March of 1916. And there they created a rival government. Then there were the more liberal types, many intellectuals who had traveled abroad, such as Chen Jixiu. Chen Jixiu published The New Youth, an article stating, "The nomenclatures of emperors and kings should have already perished after the Qing abdication. But unfortunately, the Prepare for Peace Society led to the problem of the national political system." Many pro-Yuan Shikai intellectuals suddenly turned against him, such as Li Dajiao. Born in Juli, Li Dajiao had benefited from Yuan Shikai's reforms and supported him for quite some time, but the monarchy, enraged him. As Li Jiazhao joined the anti-Yuan Shikai movement, he declared, "All those who dare to rekindle the tyrannical cinders or reignite the monarchy flames, whether the followers of the Prepare for Peace Society or the adherents of the dynastic restoration, should be regarded as traitors of the state, the public enemies of citizens. Their organization should be exterminated, their books burned, their backers eradicated, and their roots removed. Their sprouts should be destroyed so that they could never grow and proliferate. Then there will be hope of a great prospect for our country." For those who don't know, Chen Dushou and Li Jiazhao are basically the two guys who start the Communist Party in China. Thus, this very event right here is something like a kindling. Now, Japan, never one to let an opportunity slip by them, began communicating with Tai Le, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, Liang Qiqiao, and Beiyang generals like Feng Guozhang and Zhuan Qie, and they began training and arming them. Soon, military commanders in Guangxi, Guizhou, and Yunnan, working in league with Liang Qiqiao, declared war against Yuan Shikai. Zhang Xun, in Xuzhou of Jiangxi province, refused to fly the Beiyang Republican flag, and he made sure his men grew long queues expressing their loyalty to the Qing dynasty. We'll come back to that guy. He is a crazy little revolution he tries. Liang Qiqiao dispatched Tai Le to Kunming, where he met with Tang Jiyao, a local military commander, to begin a rebellion. On December the 24th, Yuan Shikai received a telegram from Tai Le urging him to return China into a republic, and had one day to do so, or else. Yuan Shikai rejected the order, and on the 25th of December, Yunnan province declared independence. Uh-oh. It's kind of like that meme. Ah, shit, here we go again. Now, the nation army consisted of three main forces: Tai Le's First Army, who marched upon Sichuan province; Li Leijin's Second Army, who marched upon Guangxi and Hunan; and Tang Jiyao's Third Army, who were held in reserve. Their goal was to occupy southern China, so a northern expedition could be launched to overthrow Yuan Shikai. On January the 1st of 1916, they issued a proclamation claiming Yuan Shikai had performed 20 egregious crimes, and that he must go into exile and let China be a republic again. Within just days, their armies were marching through Sichuan and Guizhou. By February, Guizhou declared independence, and Yuan Shikai immediately went to work stripping the rebels of their official titles, and he ordered Tao Kun to lead a military expedition against Yunnan province. Under Tao Kun was Ma Jizeng, who took an army through Hunan to attack Guizhou and Yunnan. A second force was led by Zhang Jiyao through Sichuan and then Yunnan province. And then there was a third force led by Long Jiguang, who went through Guangxi and then Yunnan province. There were fierce battles, one particularly rough one at Xuzhou, where Tai Le's armies seized the city in January but lost it by March. The war was dubbed the Strange War, because it really became a war of tongues. Each side kept throwing accusations in telegrams, newspapers, and pamphlets at the other. Now, Yuan Shikai's Beiyang forces were superior in terms of numbers, weaponry, and such, but the southerners were using terrain against them. All of the Beiyang forces were northern Chinese, not used to the southern climate, and it proved rather difficult for them to acclimate. They were also not in the greatest state of morale, having to fight for a tin pot emperor, as it were. And to be quite honest, there was many Beiyang generals who were impeding on the war effort. As a result, the Beiyang forces did not seize the quick victory that they thought they would. Although one major triumph for them was when Feng Yuxiang took Xuzhou on March the 2nd of 1916, earning himself the title of Baron. For those who don't know, Feng Yuxiang would famously become known as the Christian warlord, who would check his army's fingernails before they went into battle. I'm not making that up, and there's video footage of it. He was also the immediate rival to Zhang Zongjiang, the dog meat general. Oh yes, we're going to be talking about these two in the future quite a lot. The propaganda war between those two is just so funny and legendary. You have this Christian, basically goody two-shoes guy accusing the other guy of being a degenerate gambler and womanizer, and then the other guy's like, yeah. Anyways, it's going to be a good time. Meanwhile, Guangxi province declared independence on March the 15th, led by Lu Rongting. Looking at a brutal stalemate of war, Feng Guozhang began secretly telegramming Yuan Shikai to give up the monarchy. It was not a good sign. By early 1916, all the war fronts were seeing absolute disasters. On March the 21st, Yuan Shikai convened a special meeting with his high-ranking officials. He proposed abolishing the monarchy, and only one die-hard loyalist general, Ni Shicheng, said he shouldn't. All the rest said, yes, you should. The following day, Yuan Shikai announced his decision to step down from being an emperor. On March the 23rd of 1916, the Hongxian dynasty ended. It was around for 83 days. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube. Over there, I'm about to release another episode in my series about Japan's invasion of Manchuria, 1931 to 1932. Also, please check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where you can find more exclusive Patreon podcasts. I just finished up a 2-part series on the USS Enterprise, and now polls are going up for what will be this month's. So if you rush over now, perhaps you can get involved in that poll. I bet some of you are wondering why I titled this episode The Walrus Emperor. Honestly, I could not help myself. He was a really goofy character, and the propaganda outlets of his day drew him as this big fat walrus. Seriously, it is worth Googling Yuan Shikai Walrus. You will not be disappointed.